Hey, it is good seeing you all. Welcome to Oakcommunity.church. There it is. Hey, my name is Grayson, and I'm the pastor here, and I'm just so glad that you are here. As Dan said, you came on a good Sunday. We're having a hot dog grill out after church, and we've got the gymnasium set up, and so after service, you can grab your kids if you have them, or just take a random kid, and don't do that, but you can go grab your kids, you can go to the gym afterwards. We've got some stuff that I'll explain a little bit later for teacher appreciation, which you can participate in, but otherwise it'll be a good time of fellowship and just enjoying each other's company. We are in our 10th week, if you can believe it, going through the Gospel of Mark. And I asked this last week, but I'm curious if the opinions have changed in the room. But how many of you, by a show of hands, would say that, generally speaking, you enjoy horror movies? Anybody? It's a safe space? Okay. All right, we got a few, yeah. So maybe a fifth of the room. Horror movies it's interesting, or just horror stories in general is interesting. We think of our modern day horror stories, but really telling horror stories goes back, is an act as old as time. It has gone down through the centuries where generation after generation concocts their own horrific tales. In fact, if you look at some of the old folk tales which inspired the Disney stories, they're a lot different than what Disney made them out to be, a lot darker. And so we see that even up through our modern day. But if we think about modern horror stories, the first horror movie that was made came out in 1896. It was a French film. It was called The House or the Castle of the Devil, and it was a 3-minute long film. It was silent. It was one of the first ones. But what that did was that laid the groundwork for horror movies, for horror stories, for video games, for books, for TV shows, all of that to come, and it eventually evolved into what we get today. Now, on the one hand, horror movies, they're all in good fun, suspenseful movies. You can watch them, you can have a good time. There's nothing wrong with that. But I will say, I think one of the unintended consequences is in our culture, we've become inundated with horror movies, and particularly when they involve the supernatural, what sometimes happens is we end up reading the supernatural or seeing the supernatural stories and reading those onto the biblical text. So when we come to supernatural moments or strange moments in the Bible, we can't help but sometimes view them through the lens of these modern horror stories. And so we look at things like Dracula or The Exorcist or The Conjuring, and when we struggle to make sense of when the Bible starts to look a little bit like that. But what I want you to see this morning is we're going to look at a story that might as well have been ripped out of a modern horror movie, but with some major differences. And one of those is that instead of this story simply being a horrific tale that ends in disaster, it's one that ends up ending in hope. Hope for the person in the story, but also for us as followers of Jesus. You see, Jesus confronts somebody who many Jews, and even today, many people would be terrified to come into contact with, somebody that none of us would want to see, but yet Jesus seeks this person out and changes his life. Now, particularly, this story involves a possession, and I know in our as modern day sophisticated, scientific loving Americans, we sometimes struggle when it comes to some of those supernatural stories. And so, what I want to encourage you to do is something that C.S. Lewis wrote about in his book, The Screwtape Letters, in the introduction to that. He wrote something that I wanted to share with you, this quote. He says this, he says, "There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race, the human race, can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors." And that's what I've also seen as well, is that we tend to gravitate toward one end of the spectrum or the other, whether that is completely disbelieving in much of the supernatural, or I have found that people tend to obsess to the point where, someone's whole ministry or whole life is fixated on angels and demons and the like. And so I think C.S. Lewis gives us some wisdom. And what we see in the Bible is that Jesus absolutely believes in the spiritual and in the demonic realm. But at the same time, his entire ministry isn't centered around that. So he engages with it, yet his ministry is more than that. And so I think we can take some of the wisdom of C.S. Lewis and apply it to our own life as we read this story. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to be in Mark chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 1, and we're going to go through a good chunk of it, but we're going to break it up piece by piece. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. We're going to start in verse 1. Otherwise, the words will be up here on the screen for you to read along. So this is what Mark, the author, writes. He says this. He says, they, being Jesus and his disciples, they came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as he got out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him. He lived in the tombs, and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he had torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying and cutting himself with stones. Let's pause there for a moment. Mark, what he's doing is Mark is setting the scene for us, like in a movie. He's sort of setting up where this story takes place, and he's doing so in very vivid and colorful language. So what he says is that what we looked at last week is Jesus and his disciples had just crossed over the Sea of Galilee, and they had nearly died in the process, right? That's where they cried out and they said, "Jesus, don't you even care about us?" And then Jesus demonstrated both his care for them, but also his authority over nature. But then as soon as they get off the boat, it's dusk or twilight, it's starting to get dark, and they don't have flashlights like we do. And so it's hard to see, and lo and behold, who do they see coming but this strange, enraged man who runs to Jesus and falls at his feet. Now, the other thing is Mark says that the land that they're in is the region of the Gerasenes. This was also known as the Decapolis, which in Greek stands for the 10 cities. They were 10 Greek cities that prior to Roman occupation, they had formed an alliance. And so, in other words, for this band of Jewish men, this was enemy territory. Like, this was unwelcome territory. So for the disciples, they're thinking, for some reason, I'm in this foreign land, which I don't want to be in anyway. And now I'm not only interacting with a Gentile, a non-Jew, but now a demon-possessed Jew. It couldn't hardly get much worse than this for them. And so then we see a couple of details about this man that again, the disciples weren't alone, but there was a man with an unclean spirit. This is another word for saying he was possessed. And for a Jewish person, this situation checked all the boxes for something they would not want to be in. Something that ceremonially, it was unclean for them to be there. It was not good for them to be there. But yet, in a strange way, Jesus had led them to this exact spot. And why was that? Well, I think we'll see in a moment as we look to see what happens next. Picking back up in verse 6, Mark writes this. Mark says, well, when he, the demon-possessed man, when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and knelt down before him. And he cried out with a loud voice, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, before God, don't torment me." For he, Jesus, had told him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Verse 9, "What is your name?" he asked him. "My name is Legion," he answered, "because we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the region. Well, a large herd of pigs was there, feeding on the hillside, and the demons begged him, "Send us into the pigs so that we may enter them." So he, Jesus, gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. The herd of about 2,000 pigs rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned there. And we're going to pause again. The story keeps going, but I just want to say, can we just collectively admit that this is a weird story? Like, you can just say, it's weird. It's weird. It's weird. It's weird. And in fact, it's not just us that finds it weird. Many throughout history, many biblical commentators look at this story and they say, what on earth is going on? And so it's weird. And we come to these and sometimes we think, Jesus, what are you doing? Why did you include this story? But when we slow down, it's actually really interesting and in fact, really powerful. This is a message of hope, which can be something that we all can experience, we all can apply to our lives. But we need to understand a few things. So in the weirdness, again, this demon-possessed man comes, and the situation is worse than the disciples thought. They thought, oh great, here's a loon. Turns out he's possessed, but not just by one demon, but by many. I mean, that one verse, like "we are legion," has been taken by Hollywood and applied ad nauseum to dozens and dozens of movies. They love that line. But what we think is, a legion of Roman soldiers was between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers. And so it's possible that there were between 4,000 and 6,000 spirits. We don't know, but that's the name. The point is that there was more than one. And again, what Mark, I think, is doing here is he's, in this language, he's setting up an opponent to Jesus. He's saying, like, this is the type of being that no Jewish person would want to encounter, and no Jewish person would be able to overcome. What any normal, sane person would do in this situation is get the heck out of there. They'd get back in their boat, they'd cross over the sea. And so we see that the situation just gets worse and worse and worse. But again, Jesus doesn't go anywhere. And instead, what the man does is he bows down before Jesus, and strangely, he recognizes Jesus as the Son of the Most High God. This is a bit of irony, because even the Jewish people should have recognized Jesus as Messiah, but they didn't. Instead, the one who does recognize him is a demon-possessed man. But recognition is different than submission. So the man is not submitting to Jesus, he's just recognizing his authority. And he asks, he says, well, can you, instead of sending me from the region, can you send me into some pigs? And for some stranger reason, Jesus says, okay, go into those pigs. And then what happens is the pigs run down, about 2,000 pigs. They go and they stampede down this bank. And if you look, some scholars believe they know where on the Sea of Galilee this took place, because there's a couple of very steep banks. But they barrel down and drown in the water. Again, all of this very strange. And there's some theories for why Jesus may have allowed that to happen. Some people say it was because he wanted a physical demonstration of the spirits leaving the man, so there could be no doubt. Other people say, well, the demons didn't intend to kill themselves, but the pigs got spooked, so their lifeline, their rescue attempt ended up ending in their disaster. There's a bunch of reasons, but the point of this story, that I think the sort of idea that Mark is getting across, is even this super villain type of a character, this man possessed by thousands and thousands of demons living among tombs with almost superhuman strength, even he was under Jesus' authority. So last week it was nature, this great hurricane was under the authority of Jesus, and now this other creature, this legion of demons, also submitted themselves to Jesus. All right, with the odds stacked against them, Jesus came out on top. Now you might be wondering, well, how does this apply to us? I doubt anybody in here would say, I have 3,000 demons inside of me right now. Hopefully you wouldn't say that. But how does this apply to us? Well, see, the truth is that while none of you may have the same problems as that man, I bet there are things in your life that haunt you. I bet there are things in your past, there are mistakes that you've made. There are things that maybe you have done or that have been done to you that live in the back of your head, that you can't escape. No matter how much your spouse has said, it's okay, I know you didn't mean to. No matter how much someone else may have forgiven you, you can't forgive yourself. In fact, there was a book that was written about 14 years ago. And what this man did is he collected anonymous regrets from people from around the world. They would submit them, and he cataloged them, and he did some other things with them. But the idea was that people who may not feel safe to share some of their mistakes with people may be willing to share it anonymously. And so he collected them, and I just wanted to share a couple of those with you. Some of those regrets he were sent were like this one, for example. This person said, I regret the fact that we are $50,000 in debt outside of mortgage and cars, and that you have no idea. You hate your job so much, and if we didn't have this debt, I could support you in walking away from him. Or another submission reads, I regret all the times I have tried to stop my addiction and failed. But most of all, I regret pushing everyone away who has ever cared about me. Again, maybe there's something in your mind that you would say, if I had the opportunity to submit that regret anonymously, this is what I would say. Maybe it's a mistake you made decades ago, but you just still haven't been able to let it go. Or again, maybe it was something that was done to you that you regret happening. Something that made you feel like damaged goods. Something that made you feel less than in the eyes of God, unhuman. Whatever that is, what this story gives us hope is that no matter the thing that binds you, Jesus has the power to set you free. And in fact, the idea, if you're taking notes, this is the thing that I want you to walk away with, and it's just this, is that Jesus is greater than the things that haunt you. Jesus is greater than the things that haunt you. It doesn't matter the depression, the anxiety. It doesn't matter the things that you've done, the things that were done to you. There is a power in the name of Jesus which can break any change that surrounds you. In fact, we get a sense of this in our story with what happens with the man. I want to show you as we pick back up in the story, verse 14. Watch what happens. So it says the men who tended the pigs, the men who tended them ran off, and they reported it to the town and countryside, and people went to see what had happened. Well, they came to Jesus, and they saw the man who had been demon-possessed sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. What was their response? They were afraid. Verse 16, those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs. And then they begged Jesus, they begged him to leave their region. Well, verse 18, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged Jesus earnestly that he might remain with him. But Jesus did not let him, but told him, go to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So he, the man, went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for them, and they were all amazed. See, this is astounding for a few reasons. You have two very different responses. On the one hand, you have the response of the freed man. On the other, you have the response of the townspeople. Let's look at the townspeople first. So they had just witnessed 2,000 pigs run into the sea and drown. As far as commodities go, it was done. They couldn't retrieve them. And 2,000 pigs would have been a small fortune for that town. And so you can imagine this small town of a few hundred people losing that much product. I mean, that was going to have a real impact on their economy. But the interesting thing is that those people, they see the miracle that Jesus performs. They see this man who had likely been terrorizing their villages, causing them issues, not being able to be bound. They had to throw this guy away, and Jesus frees him. Jesus heals them. But what are they more concerned about? Their product. They said, Jesus, you need to get out of here because if you're here, who knows how much more damage you may cause to our economy. They don't say, Jesus, you saved this guy. Well, let us bring some other people to you, right? That's what we saw earlier as people were bringing the sick and the demon-possessed and people with problems. But here they say, Jesus, we see what you did to that man, but we don't really care. What we care more about are the things that we just lost. In fact, I like what pastor and author John Mark Comer once said. He said, a lot of people are fine with Jesus as long as he doesn't change anything. A lot of people are fine with Jesus as long as he doesn't change anything. Sometimes we can be guilty of this too. It's not just others, right? We can be guilty of this. We sometimes want Jesus as long as he doesn't mess with our lifestyle. We sometimes want Jesus as long as he doesn't ask us to do anything unfashionable, right? Anything we might be criticized for. Sometimes we say, well, Jesus, I want the good miracles that you do. And we see this happen. We'll see this happen again and again and again. People say, Jesus, I want the bread that you give. Man, I want the good things that you give. But as soon as you ask me to change something, as soon as you ask me to give something up, I don't know if I want that. And so we can easily slip into the mindset that the townspeople had, where you say, Jesus, you're asking too much of me. It's not worth it. And sometimes, as we see here, Jesus will just let us do that. I can remember when I was in seminary, I heard a story about a guy who had graduated. It was a classmate of mine, and he said he had a friend who graduated, and just after graduation, he managed to get a job pastoring a church in Florida, and he thought, sweet, some people have to wait years. They're working at UPS or wherever, and eventually, a decade later, they're able to pastor at a local church, but right out of seminary, he was able to get it. So this young man was excited. He flew and moved his family down to Florida, and the church was located in this gated community, this large gated community, mostly made up of retirees, but not only, but it was a wealthy community, nice little church, and he said at first things went well. He said the the people there didn't really demand a lot of him. They said, we'd love for you to preach, do some Bible studies, whatever. And he's like, this is awesome. This is sweet. I'm actually getting paid something. And the people, I guess, are kind of nice and the work's not that hard. But over the months and the years that he was there, his heart started to get burdened for the lost. He realized that the only people that were coming into their church were the wealthy residents. There was nobody far from God. There was nobody needy. There was nobody hurting. It just started to feel a lot more like a country club than a New Testament church. And so this convicted the pastor. And so what he started to do was he started to do outreach in the local community. And he was getting buses and to bus people in, homeless people and needy people and people that were very different from the community. And the congregation in the church didn't like that. And they said, listen, Pastor, we understand what you're doing, but that's not what we're paying you for. We want you to preach some sermons. We want you to do some Bible studies, do our funerals, and that's it. We don't really want to see things change. And so this man was left with a decision. He could either stay and have a fairly easy job. He could get a nice paycheck, but make a very little impact for the kingdom, or he could leave. And he prayed about it, and he said, all right, if that's what you want, I'm not your guy. And he had to leave because he realized that they didn't actually want Jesus to change anything. They wanted to consume the good things that Jesus had to offer. They didn't want to engage in the mission of Jesus, which frankly is sometimes kind of scary. See, the truth is that following Jesus changes us. And if we're not willing to let God change our life, then we're probably not ready to follow Jesus. If you're not ready to let Jesus change your life, you're probably not ready to follow him. And it's as simple as that. Now, that doesn't mean well, I guess I need to leave. No, I mean, you can continue to learn and open yourself up, but I'm telling you, like when Jesus, as we'll see later, when Jesus says you must pick up your cross and follow him, it is a call to come and die. It is a call to sacrifice everything for him. But the thing that we find is in losing our life for Jesus, we actually find it. So yes, Jesus is greater than the things that haunt you, and in order to free you of those things, sometimes it requires change. Sometimes Jesus has to get into the muck of our life and tear it apart to bring us freedom. Now, fortunately, Jesus paid the greatest price for that change. He did that on the cross. He covered the ultimate penalty, the ultimate thing which we could never cover for ourselves. He brought us forgiveness. And so now he asks us to lay down our lives for him. Now, like I said, the other astounding thing is not just what the townspeople do, but it's the good response, the positive response that the demon-possessed man had. He had been tormented by these things for so long. We don't know how long. Maybe it was a month, but maybe it was a decade. Like this person had been chained to his circumstances for so long. And then when he's freed, he comes to the man who freed him, and he says, Jesus, I want to go with you. I imagine he had more zeal probably than the disciples had. Because he had been changed much, he loved much. And so he probably had more passion for the mission of God than the disciples had, but yet Jesus says, no, I don't want you to come with us. Your calling is not to come with me. Your calling is to go and tell the people just what the Lord has done for you. And I think it's kind of cool. Mark says that Jesus says, go tell them what the Lord has done. And it says the man went into the Decapolis and proclaimed how much Jesus had done for him. And they were all amazed. Believe it or not, this is, other than Christ himself, this is the first recorded missionary in the Bible. And who was it? Was it Peter? Was it Paul? Was it John? Was it Mary? No. It was some weirdo from a no-name town who had been possessed by demons. Like, that's who it was. If you feel a little weird, you're in good company here, okay? Like, that's who it was. He went out and he told all that Jesus had done for them, and they were amazed. What we're not told is the ramifications of that, but I imagine that after the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and as the church began to expand, that there was fertile soil in those cities because of this man. And that can be true for you too. Now, there's nothing more compelling, I believe, than a changed life. Because see, the hard thing is that people, and I'll say this, that people can come in and they can listen to me, they can listen to somebody else, and they can say, well, that's some good teaching. Like, that's interesting. Oh, I learned something. Yeah, maybe they apply it. But that doesn't mean half as much as when a neighbor sees you and they say, I know who you were and I know who you are now. Because so often, and we're inundated with advertisements that, I mean, you have paid actors saying, well, this pill made me lose 50 pounds, or this like super lame contraption got me a six-pack. And like that's not real, right? They're giving you money to say that. That stuff didn't work for you. And that's why companies will so often show a before and after. Oftentimes it's a lie. Right? Oftentimes it's lighting, it's before, if they're talking about a workout, it's before they get a pump, it's before they work out. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. And so the thing is that's what we're trained to do. We're trained to look at these messages and say, gosh, there's an 80% chance that what you're saying is fake and that your Jesus is fake because that hasn't done anything in your life. But gosh, what a power it has when somebody says, I know who you were, when you're open and vulnerable about your weaknesses, and they say, wait, if that was you before and this is you now, there's hope for me. And of course, it's not because of you. It's not because you changed yourself. It's because Jesus changed you. But man, when people see that in your life, when people see that in our church, it doesn't mean you have to be perfect, but it does mean that people see that and they see the hope in you that Jesus brought into your life. So even if you're still struggling, don't give up hope. One, because Jesus is greater than the thing that you're struggling with, than your addiction, than your anxiety, than your mental illness, whatever it is. Or Jesus is greater than that. But then also, as you continue to follow Jesus in your weakness, people are going to see that and they're going to say, I want a piece of that. Now, the greatest testimony you can give is not a slick 10-minute presentation of the gospel. I encourage you, learn to share the gospel. Very important. But one of the greatest messages you can tell somebody is your life story, is your testimony. This is what Jesus did for me. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent, but I love, we've talked about it as a church before, but something called a 15-second testimony. It's where you just say, this is who I was before, this is what I struggled with before, then Jesus saved me, and this is who I am. Sometimes that's what people need to hear. They want to know that things are real. Because there's so much garbage, there's so much fakeness in the world. So show them that Jesus is real in you. Okay. Circle back. So no matter who you are, you have a story to tell. And again, your story is one of the most powerful things you can share. And so with that, as we wrap up, I want to share with you a story. This is from a man named Nick Vujicic. He's an Australian-born man, but he was born with a physical disability, as you'll see. And this physical disability, as he was growing up, made him feel like he was worthless and like there was no purpose in his life. But then as God got a hold of his heart, he changed everything. And so without further ado, let me just turn your attention to the screen and watch this short testimony of Nick Vujicic.
I love my life. As you can see, I have no arms and no legs. And it's not like one day I went to school and then kids teased me and told me that I had no arms, no legs. I knew I had no arms and legs, but I didn't think it was such a big deal until the world told me that I was an alien, that I was ugly, that I wasn't good enough. And when the doctors saw me for the first time, they apologized to my parents that they did not pick it up in the ultrasounds and give them an option to abort me. They were absolutely convinced that I'd never have a quality of life. I didn't want to be special. I just wanted to be valued. I wanted to know that I wasn't a mistake. I wanted to know that in Jeremiah 29:11, how God says he has a plan, hope, and future. I wanted that assurance that he didn't forget me. Many of us secretly struggle. I know I did. When I was 8 years old, I went into a very dark place. A depression that lasted 5 years. And that depression peaked during an attempted suicide of me trying to swallow water and then inhale water to drown myself in the bathtub of my own home. I convinced myself there was no hope. I convinced myself that there was no God, but if there was a God, he was simply unfair. I prayed for a miracle, and a miracle did not come. But I realized pretty quickly that God held me. Even when I hated him, screamed at him, and refused to talk to him, he loved me. At age 15, I read John chapter 9, a man was born blind, and no one knew why he was born that way. But Jesus said it was done so that the works of God would be revealed through him. And I realized, if God has a plan for a blind man, God's got a plan for me. It was the janitor at my high school who saw me speak in front of my school peers as the vice president. Little did I know that I would be approached by the person cleaning the toilets at my school and look at me straight in the eyes and saying, "I heard you talk." I said, "Oh, cool." He said, "It was better than cool. You're going to be a worldwide speaker." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "You're going to go around the world and speak." And I said, "No way. You're crazy. What am I going to talk about?" "Your story." I'm like, "I don't have a story." He said, "Yes, you do." We had an arm wrestle about it. And a couple months later, he organized my first speech. And during that first speech, people were crying, thinking, what's going on? But little did I know that God could use me to talk about something I thought I never had. Hope. I could very well be someone that maybe one day shares my story with more people. And maybe when I don't get a miracle, I can still be one. Well, I'll tell you right now, I have a pair of shoes in my closet in case God gives me arms and legs. But I've realized two things. Number one, the greatest miracle of all that I'll ever receive in my life is my soul being saved, me being filled with the Holy Spirit, having a relationship with Jesus where I abide in him and he abides in me, him being my comfort, my strength, giving me guidance and wisdom throughout my life. Anything more than my salvation is just a bonus. Well, he gave me a couple more bonuses. God has rescued me and blessed me. But the second thing I've realized miraculously, he delights in using the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. And I never imagined that God would take me to 78 countries, 3,500 speeches, 9.7 million people face-to-face, 1.2 million people gave their life to Jesus Christ. Largest crowd, 800,000 people, 10 different governments I was able to address, and I've been on television to 2.8 billion people. People see me without arms and legs, but I don't represent limbless people. I represent healed, broken-hearted people. To let the broken-hearted know that you can be healed and you can be a miracle too. You know, I tell people if God can use a man without arms and legs to be his hands and feet, then God can use any willing heart.
So you can, if you're interested, he's a phenomenal speaker, and you can find him on YouTube, on the internet, Nick Vujicic, or I'm sure just search Christian man with no arms and legs or something, and you'd find him. But he's a phenomenal speaker and amazing testimony. But of course, I think he would say, and I would say, his story is not about him, right? It's about Jesus. Likewise, your story is not just about you, but it's about the one who it points to, the one who healed you, the one who set you free. And so if Jesus has changed your life, my encouragement is just tell somebody about it. Tell somebody about it. You can't control what they do with it. All right, we talk about invite cards, grabbing an invite cards, which you can grab on your way out the door. But we talk about all the time that you can't control what somebody does with that card. I handed it to somebody. I was playing pickleball, and I handed it to somebody who's a great player, a super nice guy, and he just said, hey, thanks, but no thanks. All right, so it's not about what they do. It's about us being faithful to do it. So if Jesus has changed your life, tell somebody. And one of the best ways, one of the first ways we can demonstrate that is through baptism. If you have said yes to Jesus but haven't been baptized as a believer, Scripture says that is the first step. It is an outward demonstration of an inward transformation. As you go down into the waters of baptism, it's symbolizing the death of your old life, the death of your regrets, the death of your fears, the death of the things that haunt you. And it shows that you're being raised to a new life. And so if you haven't done that yet, listen, let me hear you say, before joining a small group, before eating a hot dog, like, come talk to somebody and say, I need to be baptized. The other thing is, listen, if you haven't ever given your life to Christ, and you're saying, I want hope, I want freedom from these things, you don't have to wait. All right, today can be that day. Scripture says today is the day of salvation. And that's my encouragement to you, is to say yes to Jesus, to lay it all down. Or at the very least, say yes to wanting to explore more. Because I think you'll be amazed, just like the man in our story, what you might find. All right, every fear, every sin, every wrongdoing, every misdeed, Jesus puts it in the grave because he took it on the cross.